I'm Greenwood and welcome to my studio. This video is part one of a two-part series covering bezels and cabochon stone setting. There are 7 basic steps to complete a successful bezel setting. In this video, we're going to explore the first 3 steps, and then in the video part 2, we will round out the series with the final 4 steps of soldering and cabochon stone setting. I will have a link at the end of this video for your convenience so you can watch this video first. I'd like to take some of the mystery out of bezel setting cabochon stones. Many students tense up and start getting nervous at the thought of setting a stone with a bezel. It doesn't have to be that way. The first step is understanding the types of cabochon stones that you will be setting. Let's take a look at the chart and I explain. A cabochon cut stone will have a domed top to it, and generally it will have a flat bottom. And in many cases it will have a flat side to it all the way around the circumference of the stone. Average height on those are generally 1 to 2 millimeters, but it can be taller, so be aware of that also. Another cut can have it a rounded edge all the way around the circumference. This is kind of interesting. And then also it can come down and come all the way to the bottom, and it will be a flush cut here at the bottom. Here are examples of 3 different types of cabochon cut stones. The one on the left is almost a flush cut, has a real short sidewall to it, and we can use a nice short bezel wire on this one. Makes a nice smooth transition onto the shoulder of the stone. The one in the middle has a much taller sidewall and it is straight. We have to be real careful on this one not to get the bezel wire too tall, because when we push the wire over onto the shoulder, it can look a little bit clunky because of that straight sidewall. The one on the right is a whole different story. The sidewall has a slight taper to it, so we can use a real nice short bezel wire and take advantage of that taper and just push it onto the taper, and we don't have to go all the way up to the top of the shoulder and push the bezel wire in position. The second step is making accurate measurements. There's 2 different types of measurements that we need to take. We have to find out the height of the bezel wire, the one that will fit the stone at the best, and making sure that it does push down on the stone and hold the stone in place, but that it's not too high that when you push it down it starts wrinkling and it has a lot of excess metal there. And I alluded a little bit to that in the last clip, but we'll talk more about that in just a moment. The second measurement that we need to take is the length of the bezel wire. This is really important because we want to make sure that we have enough to go around the stone and fit the stone. And I know that you're looking at this chart behind me and saying, oh no, Greg, all this math, we got math to do here. You're going to really enjoy this method. It's real easy, it's not complicated at all, and it will save you a lot of time and energy. And it is very, very accurate, and you're going to appreciate knowing how to do it. But I'm going to show you 2 different methods, one with the math and one without the math. Let's take a look at the math one first. To figure out the length of the bezel wire that we need to go around our stone, we're going to use a very, very simple formula. We take the diameter of the stone plus the thickness of the bezel wire times pi. This is the only math part of it. 3.14 is pi, which will equal the length. Now the diameter is going across the stone. If we had a round stone, this is really easy to calculate. You just measure once and you know the diameter. But if you have an oval like this stone that we're going to be using, we have to do one more tiny little step. We have to measure with our calipers the length of the stone and the width. We add the length and the width together and divide that by 2, which will give us our diameter. So very easy to do, no problem whatsoever. Let's take our stone, which is the one that we'll be using in the demonstration, and we'll start doing some measurements on it. You can take your calipers, turn them on, zero them out, and measure our length, which is 39 millimeters. Measure our width, which is 30 millimeters, which we add those two together, comes up to be 69 millimeters. We divide that by 2, which gives us 34.5 millimeters. So now we can take this number here and plug it into our formula. We have the 34.5 millimeters plus the thickness of the bezel wire that we're going to be using is 0.5 millimeter, so it's 0.5 millimeters. Add those two together, comes out to be 35 millimeters. We take that times pi, 3.14, and that equals 109.9 millimeters. We're going to round this off to 110 millimeters. That's the length that we're going to be needing for our stone. You see, I told you it was easy. We want to find the right height for the bezel wire to match the stone. The flat part of our stone is right through here, and all I do is just lay the bezel wire up against it, and our bezel wire is about 4 millimeters wide or tall. And you'll see if I lay this up against here, it has just a minimum amount there at the top to bend over onto the shoulder of the stone to hold it. So this will be the right size that we want to use. Now we're ready to measure off the 110 millimeters on the bezel wire. I've set my calipers to 110, and I want to come in from this end just a little ways to give some overlap when we're ready to cut it. We'll mark it right at this point. Now that we have it marked, I'm going to cut over here and leave a little bit extra for some overlap. The second method for cutting the length of the bezel wire without the math is to take a bezel wire and cut it a little bit longer than the circumference of your stone. In this case, we know it's 110, so I cut it a little bit extra with some overlap. Then you take the bezel wire and you want to start the curve for the bezel. You can take a mandrel and start wrapping the bezel wire around it nice and tight, and you're going to be curling it around the bezel wire at a smaller size than your size of your stone, so you get some good overlap. The bezel wire will have a little bit of spring in it, so that's why you want to go a little bit on the small side. If there are any little kinks in it, take your rawhide mallet and give it some gentle taps, all going all the way around, and that will smooth that bezel wire out. If you've hammered your bezel wire with the rawhide mallet, make sure that you do go back and anneal the bezel wire and soften it again, because that hammering with the rawhide mallet, even though it might be gentle, will work harden it slightly, and you want to make sure that the bezel wire is as soft as possible when you're wrapping it around the stone. Now take your bezel wire, because it is in a circle, you want to pull it out slightly, or just kind of push down on this back edge right here, and that will start making it more into an oval. Then you can place it over the stone, and I like to start from the opposite side, especially with a large stone like this. Snuggle it into the back so it's snugged up right against the stone, and then I can take one side and start pushing it around with my fingers and make it flat against the stone up to the front area here, and then do the same thing on the other side. Push it up with your fingers and make it nice and tight against the stone. Take a look down at the stone to make sure that it's fitting properly all the way around. You can hold it with your one finger and then take a marker and mark the top of the bezel wire where it overlaps. Now we have the mark where it is exactly the right length for the stone. Now we're ready to cut our bezel wire to the correct length. We have our marks that I marked on the top where the two meet, and I've made a little tiny mark just down on the side of the bezel wire so we can see it in the video. There are 3 different ways that you can cut this bezel wire. The first one, which many people do, is using a shear. I don't like using a shear at all because it's a scissor action and it will take these edges and kind of fold them over a little bit. I don't like that method, so let's throw out the shears. The second method that many people use is with a jeweler's saw. The jeweler's saw, I've been using it for many years on bezels. But I have found that it's sometimes a little bit difficult because the jeweler's saw will have a tendency to catch on the bezel and kind of bend it a little bit, or it also leaves a rough edge for soldering. Now I've been trying to figure out a way that we can do a little bit better job at cutting the bezel wire, and what can we use? I'd like to make this foolproof because not everyone has good skills using the jeweler's saw. What I've decided to use is the ultra flush cutters. These are awesome for cutting bezel wires. The ultra flush cutters have a real flat edge on one side of the cutter compared to the tapered side. These are not just regular cutters. They're the ultra flush cutters, and that leaves a nice square edge on the one side. Let's take a close-up look at a bezel wire cut with a jeweler's saw and with the ultra flush cutters. The one on the left has been cut with a fine jeweler's saw blade. The one on the right has been cut with an ultra flush cutter. You can see the big difference in them. The one with the blades really got some scratches on it, it's a little more rough, and the one on the right is nice and smooth and even. Now we're ready to cut the bezel wire with the flush cut cutters. Bring it up to our mark, and because they're nice and straight, I can cut it at almost any angle, but I try to get it as straight as possible. Then we'll take that nice straight cut and overlap onto the other side of the bezel, bring it up to the mark, and we'll be ready to mark it. Take our fine point marker. Now you see that the mark is a little bit crooked there, but I know that I've got it straight up at the top half, so I'm going to match my flush cut cutters right up to that mark and keep it parallel with the mark that I put at the top and cut it nice and straight. Because the cutters are straight, they will match up perfectly, and then we'll be ready to solder them together. This technique of cutting is the exact same for the measured 110 millimeter bezel wire that we cut before. It's always a good idea to double check your length measurements before you cut the bezel. Remember, measure twice and cut once. Now we have your stone identified, the bezel accurately measured, and the bezel accurately cut. These 3 steps are extremely important so we can move on to the next steps of setting your stone. To move to the next video, go ahead and click the link and you will learn lots more. See you on the other side.